So we've looked at Piaget's cognitive development stages and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How do these apply to exploitative marketing tactics? Well, they're related in numerous ways. Okay, and what I'm going to do is give you like 7 really important examples here. There are many more, but these are, the 7 examples that are so very important. So this is really like the meat and potatoes of this lecture, very important material coming in this segment. And so you're going to want to take especially good notes on this. And it's really interesting. What does all this have to do with exploitative marketing? We're looking at incomplete cognitive development and that we see in kids, right? This is perfectly normal in kids. So why, because of this, are kids more vulnerable to exploitative marketing? Why are they such vulnerable targets? Okay, so first one here says figure ground blurring. Research has found that by the age of 2, 90% of U.S. kids are watching TV on a regular basis. However, until they are at least able to think concretely, remember that's not till about the age of 7, they are not able to distinguish between TV programs and ads. Remember that figure ground gestalt issue from our decision-making lecture? So this is called figure ground blurring. Kids are more likely to blur figure and ground, in other words, not recognize an ad for what it really is, than adults. Also, so our second one here, increased vulnerability to peer pressure. Ads targeting children often target social and esteem needs. And note how low social and esteem needs are on Maslow's hierarchy, meaning that these are generally stronger for kids than adults. Because adults, not always, but oftentimes have progressed further up the hierarchy. So kids tend to be significantly more vulnerable to peer pressure compared to adults. The next one here says rumination without reason. Once children develop object permanence, which is usually by 2 years old, right? They are able to continue thinking about and longing for an object long after their exposure to the ad, but without the ability to reasonably evaluate the pros and cons, because these are abstract concepts. And abstract reasoning doesn't develop until much later, right? Later in the formal operation stage. In other words, before that, kids are able to ruminate, but without reason. Number 4 here says lack of symbolic thinking / experiences. So children must be able to think concretely and have experience working with symbols, remember, numbers, for example, in order to evaluate how reasonable a price may or may not be. However, they do not master this level of concrete thinking until much later in the concrete operation stage. Thus, they lack the ability to evaluate prices and budgets before then. Number 5 says egocentricity limitations. While children still think egocentrically, they are unable to see things from another person's point of view, right? Thus, they're unable to understand parents' concerns, such as limited finances, right? And then we have centration limitations. Another vulnerability of children in the pre-operational stage and younger is centration limitations. When kids can only think about one thing at a time, they clearly cannot consider all the pros and the cons. In fact, these skills increase with practice, and even kids in the formal operation stage have limited experience with such critical thinking skills compared to adults. And if all this is not enough, okay, we have a particularly strong one we're going to end up with. Example here, frontal lobe limitations. So finally, the frontal lobe is not fully developed until young adults are about 24 years of age. This means that teenagers and most college students' frontal lobes are not yet fully developed. The frontal lobe, remember, is responsible for critical thinking skills, for having foresight, being able to see into the future, to anticipate making different responses and kind of a foresight of what the different consequences would be of that in the future. So critical thinking skills, foresight, and impulse control, meaning that those of younger ages are more vulnerable to all advertising tactics and more likely to buy impulsively. Many banks target teenagers and college students and provide them with too much easy credit, which really puts them into financial difficulties for years. The average graduate leaves college with more than $18,000 in credit card debt alone, often coupled with a low credit rating. So remember, responsible management of one's finances requires foresight and impulse control, higher level thinking, which is governed by the frontal lobe. Okay, so we've been looking at how incomplete cognitive development and needs makes kids vulnerable targets of exploitative marketing. Now let's think about cognitive deficiencies. What do they have to do with it? Well, any and all of the limitations we discussed in prior slides can be the result of cognitive deficiencies. Also, while people of all ages can have cognitive deficiencies, seniors are more vulnerable as a group than young people. Now, not all seniors develop cognitive deficiencies. In fact, most do not. But there are a number of dementias, and just as an example, let's look at Alzheimer's. The loss of cognitive and physical abilities progresses backwards systematically with Alzheimer's. What that means is this: let's say that a man is, chronologically speaking, 75 years old, but he has all the Alzheimer's, and he has progressed backward over time, over the years. So he's progressed to 74, 73, 72, 71. He's living in the head that he had when he was younger, meaning that anything that he gained or learned, between those years, he's lost, right? So he's going to be progressing backward over the years. So let's say if he learned to play the piano at 60, if he reaches the cognitive age of 59, he will lose that ability. So if he lives long enough to progress back to the age of learning simple math, he'll lose that. If he lives long enough to progress back to the age of a toddler, at some point he will lose control of, for instance, his bladder muscles. So every single one of the vulnerabilities we looked at from incomplete cognitive development can come into play over time with Alzheimer's. This concludes our really expanded exploration of exploitative marketing. Now our last acquisition controversy is an interesting one because it pertains to an unethical consumer behavior, consumer fraud and theft. Marketing that promotes materialistic mindsets and creates insatiable desires can really prompt unethical consumer behavior, such as shoplifting, fraud like insurance fraud, and piracy, such as music, movies, internet services, etc. The decision to engage in such behavior really comes down to this psychological equation that you see on your slide. Rewards minus punishments plus justifications equals the decision. So notice, first there comes a cost-benefit analysis, right? The rewards, for instance, the benefits of using the item or service, really must be weighed against the costs. such as the risk of getting caught and associated punishments. But even when benefits outweigh the risks, conscience can still override unless enough justification is perceived. Research has found that two particularly powerful justifications, the two most powerful ones, are one, perceived norms, in other words, the mindset that, oh, everyone is doing it, and two, the lack of perceived harm, or the mindset, they'll never notice the loss, right?